Thank you for joining. I'm going to be talking today about some new developments in what we call renal replacement therapy. And then I'll address any questions you might have after. So welcome and thanks for taking the time to join. So I thought I would start off by just mentioning the fact, which is pretty well known, that dialysis changed nephrology from what we call a palliative care specialty to where we can manage patients chronically, which means over a long period of time. And it also allowed the development of kidney transplantation to take place, because before that, even if we had transplantation, we wouldn't have been able to maintain patients long enough prior to or after if the kidney didn't do well. And hemodialysis has been around for about 60 years. And peritoneal dialysis, another form of dialysis, has been around for about 40 years. And the dialysis space has been stagnant for some time. There's not been a lot of new scientific or clinical changes in nephrology like there has been in other subspecialties. Now, as far as the history of hemodialysis, William Koff is considered the father of dialysis. And it was actually during World War II in Nazi-occupied Netherlands that he, in a small hospital at Groningen, began the first trials with a dialysis machine that he had created in a young man with renal failure. And he actually had done this with sausage casings, cellulose sausage casings, that he put the blood through, and that was the dialyzer. He put the blood through the center of the sausage casing, as you see below here, and the outside was placed in a solution. So all the poisons from the blood diffused from the center to the outside, and he put the sausage casings in a huge drum. And actually, the original solutions were fed by gravity. There weren't motors and everything else. And he created this rotating drum device, which offered effective treatment in 1943. So that's the beginning of dialysis. And then at the Peter Brent Brigham in Boston, a new version of the machine that he had created was developed and was used at the same time to support kidney transplantation. But there was still cellulose wrapped around a drum, and it was connected to latex tubing to the patient's bloodstream. This is a version of a little bit of a later machine. And the device was built by Edward Olson, who produced more devices. And at the time in 1950, the thing cost, a mere $5,600. Koff went on to work on artificial lungs, artificial eyes, and you might remember the Jarvik 7 heart. Got a lot of press years ago. As far as peritoneal dialysis, peritoneum is from the Greek, and I hope I pronounced this properly, and if I don't, please accept my apologies. But here's the word in Greek, and it means to stretch around, and it first appeared in 1550 BC. In a papyrus, the so-called Ebers papyrus in Egypt. And I won't go through all these things that occurred, but eventually we ended up with peritoneal dialysis, shown here, where a catheter is in the abdomen, in the peritoneal cavity, and the dialysis doesn't utilize blood, but there's a solution going into the peritoneal cavity and then removed after a couple hours, and then a new solution put in. And there isn't a dialyzer either. Like here, we use the cells in the peritoneal membrane that's in all of us to do the dialysis. But this has been the way nephrology has looked for all these years, without very little change. And then in 2016, there was a White House organ summit. And the thought was we need to improve breakthroughs in research in these areas. And in 2019, the Kidney Health Initiative published a roadmap for new approaches in renal replacement therapy. Also around that time, the Kidney X Prize was established, We have won one of those prizes for our development of the artificial kidney that we're working on. So putting more money into prizes was one motivation. And then in 2019, the FDA also approved a breakthrough device program in which technologies for mobile dialysis was considered a priority for biomedical engineering. And then in 2019, the president issued an executive order advancing a healthcare initiative in kidney health for America. And you can see the verbiage here, but it involved preventive initiatives, patients with CKD, to slow down their rate of progression of CKD. It encouraged the development of an artificial kidney. And also there were initiatives to increase access to transplants. So here's some of the devices people are working on. One is called a wearable peritoneal device, peritoneal dialysis device. So instead of lying in a bed at night and having the solutions coming in and then being drained every 2 hours, the thought was, and this is a complicated slide, but the basic idea is you'll have the same solution going in and out. And the concept of using the same solution then is nice, but it requires that you clean up that solution and make it fresh again without dumping it and taking a new one. So people were working on so-called technologies that they call dialysate regeneration, to take that drained dialysate and reconvert it into a fresh dialysate. And there's different ways to do that. In general, they utilize different things that absorb the substances that you're trying to remove, like the urea, the other substances. You absorb them out of that solution and then use the solution again. And there's a purse size controller with batteries. It's portable. The idea is that this will be portable with a small pump, and the same solution is pumped around and around and around. The device continuously removes the dialysate, regenerates it, which means it makes it fresh again, and infuses it into the patient. It repeats about 8 times an hour. And the cartridges that are used to clean up the solution last about 7 hours, so they have to constantly be changed. And then periodically the patient can't do this anymore and has to put in a fresh solution. So the idea is you can be ambulatory when it's occurring, and you don't need to use up as much solution, so it's cheaper for the healthcare industry. These different groups are working on this. So far, nothing has come of it clinically. It's been around now for 6 years or more. This is another device from Victor Gura at Cedars-Sinai. Basically, what he's done is taken a dialysis machine and now shrunk it. So you're walking around with a dialysis machine on your belt. Basically, it's got batteries, pumps, and everything. It's hooked up to your bloodstream, unlike peritoneal dialysis. Actually, it's not a totally original idea. The first paper describing this was in 1976 by Stevens et al. Same type of idea. But basically, take a dialysis machine, shrink it down to where a patient can walk around with it. Other entities are developing suitcase-size hemodialysis machines that you won't walk around with, but will just be placed in a room, either in the dialysis unit or on your desk. And then other tabletop devices. These are just still hemodialysis. The machine is smaller. The problems with this device is it can clot. There's elevated concentrations of ammonia or carbon dioxide. You get battery failure, gas bubbles. The lines can kink, and there's problems potentially with the pump function. So again, a concept that some people think will be utilized. In general, I don't think many patients are going to want to walk around with this for a number of reasons. One, people want to appear normal when they see other human beings. They don't want to let them know of what's going on with them in general medically. People, especially men. Men have a hard time talking about their medical conditions or seeing a doctor. So in general, human beings are not going to walk around with this or be seen like this. And in general, there's nothing new about this technically. It's just a shrunken hemodialysis machine. Another group is working on another entity, which they have different names for. This is the San Francisco group. They have 2 components of the device. One is a filter, and the other does the ion transport. So the kidney isn't just a filter. It keeps the chemistry of your blood constant, not by filtration, but by transporting substances in and out of what's called the nephron, the tubule part. And it's a very complicated process. There are several problems with this, even though they get a ton of press. There's 45 at least different cells in the kidney. The kidney at a cellular level is complicated or more complicated than the brain. And all the cells in the kidney have different functionalities. Do the ion transport. Well, the cells in their device are actually very simple. They're from a cell line. They're from a pig cell line that they've studied. These cells don't even do the necessary transport of one of the many things the kidney does. And the kidney transports hundreds of things. And the kidney doesn't have one cell that does everything. It's just impossible to do biologically. There's specialized cells that all do different things. The other issue with this type of approach is that when you take a kidney cell out of a kidney and put it in a device like this or in a culture dish, immediately it recognizes the new environment and changes its properties. It's not the same cell anymore, let alone that you need multiple cell types of specialized function. No one has ever taken a cell out of a kidney and maintained its properties. So you'll hear a ton of press about this, a ton of PR about it, but biologically, it's impossible to do what they want to do. Even if you had the cell do what you want to do, the cells have to stay alive and maintain that function over time. No cell has ever done that either. The cells die. The overall function of the kidney is also in our bodies, referring to, is determined not only about the cell types and their individual function, but by the three-dimensional spatial organization of the kidney, which is highly complex. These cells talk to each other in a three-dimensional way. The entire overall structure of the kidney is complex, let alone its cellular details. And the other thing is you would have to prevent rejection from occurring. These are foreign cell types. And as I mentioned, so far they're utilizing a cultured pig kidney cell line, which is available to all labs, which have insufficient transport of even the one or two things, the salt and the water they're talking about. So this is getting a lot of press. And the big elephant in the room, creating something that does the ion transport, is not going to be solved with this approach. Another thing you might hear about is this NIH rebuilding a kidney consortium. Millions and millions of dollars are being spent trying to get different groups to try to work out ways of rebuilding a kidney from scratch. You might hear the word stem cells. Of course, you've heard the word stem cells. What I say to everyone who asks me this very common question, what do you think of stem cells? I have a very short answer. It would be easier for me to build a 747 airplane out of stem cells than to build a kidney. A 747 airplane is much simpler to build than a kidney. Kidney, as I say, is one of the most complex devices in the universe. Some people say the brain is. I can argue with others that the kidney is equally as complicated in what it does. And no human will ever be able to replicate the function of what our kidney does. And we'll talk about why that is not necessarily an issue. But to replicate the kidney by making a kidney from cells is something that I predict will never, ever, ever be done, at least for another 20, 30, 40 years. So stem cells, I feel, are a ton of PR also, and will never actually lead to a functional artificial kidney or a functional kidney. Another group, Miromatrix, it's a company actually, has the idea of taking pig kidneys, getting rid of all its cells, and leaving just sort of the scaffold or the matrix that we call. It's like a building. Imagine you had a building and you blew out all the rooms and the furniture, and you were left with just the steel girders. Then what they say they're going to do is take this building without any rooms, without any furniture, just the steel girders, and they're going to put in stem cells that are then going to go and create the building all over again. That's really what they're saying will occur. Not only will the cells know where to go, but they will actually then turn into the individual cells in a three-dimensional way and create a kidney again. And I think if this movie works, there they go, infusing stem cells into a decellularized, they're saying they're going to do it with a liver too. So this is used to be a liver, but they've gotten rid of all its cells and they're perfusing it with liver stem cells. Well, you can guess what the problems are. Number one, imagine you had a building with nothing in it, and now you have a river coming in with stem cells. And now you're going to have the furniture go back into the right floor, in the right rooms on that floor. The pictures on the wall are going to suddenly appear again, the chairs, all the electrical wiring, all the lighting, everything's going to suddenly be. What I was saying was, imagine a building with nothing in it, and now you pump in river stem cell into the building, into the first floor. And this river with stem cells now goes into every room, and you recreate the building again. All the pictures on the walls appear, all the furniture appears, the tiling, the electrical, the plumbing, everything. And now we've got a building that looked like it did before. This is really what someone's telling you when they say they can create a kidney out of stem cells that are just flushed into the kidney. It's a pipe dream. But yet they have millions of dollars of funding. In fact, they were just sold to another company. And then, of course, there's rejection issues on this, unless they're their own patient stem cells. Xenotransplants is something you might have heard of. This means interspecies transplantation between any two animals that aren't the same, or any two entities that aren't the same species. This is serious science, and there's hundreds of millions of dollars being put into creating pig colonies that create organs that a human won't reject. And there's several and this has been going on for some time, this kind of science. There's several biological hurdles. One is obviously the rejection. In biology, we have three types of rejection. We have what's called hyperacute rejection, acute rejection, and not shown here is chronic rejection. And what needs to be solved is the hyperacute and the acute. That means rejection. That hyperacute is rejection that occurs within minutes. You put the pig kidney in a baboon or human, and it gets rejected immediately. That's been pretty much solved. There's now transgenic pigs that have been created, and they don't have the hyperacute rejection. The acute rejection, the thought by the FDA is it doesn't need to be solved because we'll just use drugs that humans now get in human transplantation to minimize the acute rejection. And that's actually the goal of the FDA, not to create new perfect kidneys that will never get a rejection, but just to have the rejection rate the same as the human, and two, that the drugs that work on the human will work on the pig. They won't need new drugs to be created. That still hasn't been done, but that's the goal. Now, in addition to the rejection, there's a problem with what's called PERVs. PERVs stand for porcine endogenous retroviruses. Pigs, in their DNA, have DNA that codes for a number of viruses. They have like 40 or 50, or actually 62, sorry. At least 62 sequences in their DNA, in their cells, in every cell of their body, that encodes these different viruses. And the FDA and researchers are very afraid that if they put these kidneys into a human, even if they solve the rejection, they're going to generate viruses that will kill the human who got the transplant. So in 2015, they were already knocked out in cells. And in 2017, Church and colleagues, they formed a company called eGenesis. They created PERV-free pigs. Now, this is a controversial issue. Some people think it's not going to be a problem. We don't need to go to this extent. They knocked out all the 62 different sites. It was a Herculean task. Whether it needs to be done is not clear. A lot of this funding comes from Martine Rosenblatt, who is the founder of Sirius Radio. His daughter had what's called pulmonary hypertension, and he is interested in the same problem, getting pig lungs to be transplanted into a human. Doesn't matter that it's kidney or not. Once you solve the rejection problem or the perf problem, you solve it for every organ. So these pigs can be used as a source of hearts, lungs, livers, kidneys. It's going to be a multi-billion dollar business if anyone solves this, and people know it who have money. So a ton of money is being put into this. And I think he actually bought my Miromatrix recently. You can look that up. But the goal is to have pig farms that have these pigs that will not be rejected. He's already created big helipads in Texas to fly the organs all over the states. People will be creating more local pig farms, perhaps, or more local ways of transporting the organs to all the hospitals. It's going to be a big industry in the future. And also, if you think about it, will be an answer to not just people who need a new organ, but for people who have diseases where there is no treatment. No, so let's say, for instance, you have cancer in the liver, let's just say, as a hypothetical, and there is no treatment for it, and it's localized. Okay, you remove the liver and you put in a pig liver. You need a liver now because the doctor removed it, not because the liver was damaged and didn't function. It was because you had something else wrong with part of the liver, a liver cancer, and you want to get rid of it and you can't. You don't have drugs for it. So it'll also be able to be used for many diseases where patients don't have a pill or a drug answer to solve the problem. And the organ will simply be removed, or the tissue will be removed, and it'll be replaced with pig tissue or pig organ. So it has a more widespread application than just people whose total organ have failed. Another approach which came out in a paper not too long ago was to not utilize the whole tissue, but first to use human cells that line all our blood vessels. So the thought was, you take a pig that still would reject, do nothing to its DNA or have anything special about the pig. You put this pig kidney in the human, it'll reject immediately. But what you do is you take out this pig organ and then infuse it with these cells from the human called EPC cells that line all the blood vessels, and turn these endothelial cells that are the normal cell that line the blood vessels into human cells. Why is that something that'll help? Why is it that just lining the blood vessels with a human cell and keeping all the other cells in the organ pig-derived will help? And that is because when the human cells are lining all the blood vessels in this pig kidney, the kidney cells that come after the lining of the blood vessels won't see anything abnormal, won't be told to reject. The signals have to get through the blood vessels first into the rest of the tissue. So the thought is here, it's almost like you put plastic. You can think of it like that, impermeable plastic in all the blood vessels. And there's tons of them in every organ, including the kidney. And that will protect the kidney from recognizing that it's foreign and be rejected, and send signals to the rest of the human body to get rejected. So it's a really interesting idea. Forget fixing all the cells in the pig, just line them with this human cell line derived cells or human cells, and trick the organ into thinking prevent the rest of the pig derived cells from even seeing an abnormality. And this has been done sort of proof of principle in the paper. It hasn't led to anything clinically yet. Well, when we decided to get into this with what we decided to do, we wanted to take a lesson from the Wright brothers. We made a decision early on to stay totally away from biological materials. And in fact, people were still, before the Wright brothers, trying to create airplanes that were modeled on bird wings. You had all these devices that had wings flapping up and down. So we decided, first of all, to not use anything biological. No stem cells, no cells from a cell line, nothing like that at all, since there was no evidence, and there's still no evidence to me it will ever work, even though people are getting millions and millions of dollars to study these things. And we decided to utilize the Wright brothers approach, and that is to ask, first of all, back up a little bit. And as different as an airplane is from a bird, we had no reason a priori to think that what we're creating had to be modeled exactly in how nature did it with the kidney. We would back up and ask, what are the principles that we need to do to replicate the functionality of the kidney to keep a human alive, even if our device looks very different from a kidney? It's the same thing as with ChatGPT and your computer. The inside does not look anything like your human brain, but in many instances, it's far superior to your brain. It's the same sort of thing. You don't have to replicate what nature did, and we can't anyway. So what are the functional requirements to create an artificial kidney? First, you have to filter blood. And what you're doing when you're filtering is not getting rid of poisons. The poisons go through the filter. What you're doing is preventing the things in blood that you don't want to get into through the filter from coming into the urine. And those are the cells in our blood, red cells, white cells, and platelets. We don't want to be peeing those out in the artificial urine, just like our kidney doesn't excrete those, because our kidney has filters, 1 million filters in each kidney that prevent these cells from coming through. We also don't want to let through the filter with what are certain proteins that we call albumin and globulin. Albumin is what egg white is made out of. It's the most common protein in blood. You don't find that in your urine. It doesn't get through the filter, and we don't want it to get through our artificial filter. So we have to create a filter, an artificial filter that will simulate the filtration of the millions of filters we have in each kidney. We also want to prevent sugar from coming out in the urine, even though it'll get through the filter. Our kidney lets the sugar through. Glucose is sugar, and it doesn't come out in the urine because the kidney has developed ways of bringing that back into the bloodstream. We don't have those abilities. We have to come up with another way of preventing the sugar, which gets through the filter easily, from coming through into the final urine. And then there's all these chemical substances shown in short form here, if any of you remember your chemistry. This is sodium, this is potassium, this is chloride, bicarbonate, calcium, magnesium, phosphate. All these ions the kidney regulates in our blood. And we have to make sure that these things are transported properly to keep the input from this should be flipped, to keep the input of these substances from our diet equal to what the kidney gets rid of. Because if someone asks another person what the kidney does, you'll hear 100 people saying, oh, it gets rid of poisons. You'll hear another 100 saying, oh, it's a filter. Both are imprecise answers. If someone asks you what the kidney does, you'd say something that they won't expect you to say. And that is, the kidney is a chemical computer. That's what it is. The purpose of the kidney is to take chemical information and make the decision of what to get rid of in your urine. And why does it need to do that? It's because the purpose of the kidney is to keep your blood chemistry constant. Why does it need to do that? It's because every time you eat, you massively change your blood chemistry. Thousands of substances are going up or going down, and they're not compatible with life. The change in that chemistry is not compatible with life. The kidney recognizes the change in thousands and thousands of substances and then makes a decision. I mean, it's not a brain, it doesn't have a consciousness, but there's signals that tell it what to do. And it then changes the excretion of these substances and puts X amount of these substances into the urine, such that in a day, if I measure your blood chemistry, it hardly changes. It's like a thermostat. But it's not just for one thing, it's for thousands of things. And it's only when the kidney function decreases very, very significantly that you start seeing significant changes in the blood chemistry. And if it gets down to about 10% of normal, which is, you can think of as the eGFR being 10 or 15, it's only then that we have to come in as a human and do something, or the patient's not going to live a long time. We have to do something to keep their blood chemistry constant, which is what dialysis does. So the kidney is like the brain. The brain takes in sensory information and makes decisions. The kidney takes in chemical information, and makes decisions as to how to keep your blood chemistry constant. That's what the kidney does, and that's what any artificial or kidney device has to do. The kidney also keeps your water input and output equal. The volume of urine that you have, just the water part, not what's in it, just the water part, is roughly equal to your water intake. So when you drink a liter, you pee a liter. You drink 2 liters, you pee 2 liters. You drink half a liter, you pee half a liter. That's why when people, one of the common questions we get asked all the time is, how much water should I drink? And you're going to get 1,000 doctors giving you 1,000 different answers. And the answer is, drink when you're thirsty. Unless you're an athlete and you're losing a ton of water through your sweat. There you have to think about you have to think intellectually above your thirst to make a decision how much water to drink, because you don't want to rely only on your thirst and get dehydrated. But in general, if you have normal brain and you have a normal kidney, you don't have to drink 2, 3, 4, 5 liters of water a day. All you're going to do is pee it out. That's the paradox. People think when they drink 2 or 3 liters of water or 8 glasses of water a day, they're doing something. All they're doing is making their kidney have to pee out more water. The kidney won't allow the water to be retained in your blood. If your kidney's normal, it's just going to recognize it and pee it out. It's like the drain in your bathtub. So you don't do anything by intellectually drinking more than your thirst mechanism. And it's a common question we get asked. The problem is most doctors don't tell you that. They say, oh, drink, 8 to 10 glasses of water a day. It's not the right answer. The right answer is, if you have a normal brain and you have a normal kidney, your brain will tell you when to drink. And by that, we don't mean just water. We're talking about all fluids. It can be soup, coffee, tea, whatever the water finds itself in. Go by your thirst. Again, unless you're an athlete. Middle molecule, or this can say uremic toxin excretion. There are things that build up in the blood when the kidney doesn't work well. They're called uremic toxins or middle molecules. There's evidence that one should think about these things and try to have an artificial device also get rid of these. And then we also wanted the device to be implantable, and therefore we can't use dialysis, which relies on an external water source, something called a dialysate, and a dialysis machine. So one would have to come up with a way of controlling the chemistry of blood without using dialysis, which is the only way it's been done for 50, 60 years. No one has another way of doing it. And the kidney, it doesn't do one thing. The kidney is like the brain. It does thousands of things. And so creating an artificial kidney is significantly harder than creating an artificial heart, which is a simple pump. It does one thing, it pumps. The problem with creating an artificial heart is not creating the pumping function. It's that the lining of the heart is such that the blood doesn't clot, and people haven't solved that still. Nature has created surfaces on our blood vessels and organs that keep the blood from clotting. And we know that when we cut our finger, immediately it forms a clot. That cannot occur in our bodies. Otherwise, we'll block our blood vessels and have a stroke or heart attack. So our blood doesn't clot. And it's because the surfaces of our blood vessels are coated with substances that prevent the blood from clotting. So the pancreas is another organ that also people have created and are working on. And again, even though it's a bit harder because you have to have feedback controls and sensors for glucose and insulin secretion, it's still far easier than making an artificial kidney. It's like the difference between going to Mars and driving to Westwood. Okay, so in thinking about all these things, the goal was to develop a new technology that does not utilize dialysis, water, dialysate, or cells, including stem cells. Stay away from it. Now, not utilizing water was not only because of the fact that an implantable kidney can't have an external water source. But because there's a ton of water used in dialysis, you may not know, but about 6.2 billion gallons of water are used by the dialysis industry in the United States per year. This is, when you do the math, enough to feed all the livestock in the United States water. That's how much water is used by the dialysis industry. Plus, there's a carbon footprint, because in creating dialyzers, in creating dialysate, there's a carbon footprint. And in Australia, I think a number of years ago, there was a study done, something like a third, I can't remember the exact number, 25 to 30% of the carbon footprint was due to the dialysis industry. So that's one reason to try to come up with something that doesn't utilize water. In addition, not all countries have access to water like we do here. And even there's a difference within the United States in different states. So for all these reasons, one had to come up with a technical solution that didn't use water. So in 2016, we started building our artificial kidney device. We're still not finished. I'm just going to show you a little bit of where we are. And the goal was not to replicate all the functions of the kidney, but to replicate the functionality of the things that needed to be done to keep a human alive. And 4 parts of the device were developed. One is called the ultrafiltration module, which did that filtering to let everything through except the cells and the proteins, the egg white that I talked about, that's made up of albumin, which is the major protein in our blood. Another entity called a nanofiltration module, which prevented sugar from coming out into the final urine. An electrodeionization module, whose purpose was to do the ion transport, and then a reverse osmosis module that would keep the water excretion normal. And this just shows the technical complexity, a schematic of all the components of the devices. I won't get into any of this, but just to show how it's able to control potassium. And this isn't in a human, this is outside, and this isn't blood, it's just a solution with potassium coming into it. And then the solution is spiked. The potassium goes from this normal level to this high level, and then we turn on the device and we see how the potassium can be brought back to normal, and this is being done without dialysis. This just shows the components of the external portable device now. We have better pictures. This is the one I found for this talk, but it doesn't tell you anything about what this is. It just shows you the complexity of the different components. And again, this is all chemical and electrical engineering. There's no cells or anything here, and this just shows a CAD drawing of the components. The application of the technology can also be for portable or an implantable, but it can also be used to regenerate dialysate. So even in normal dialysis or peritoneal dialysis, the technology that we're developing can be used to replenish the dialysate so that less will be needed. These are just some of the folks I'm working with. Roland Ludlow, and he was involved with this company called U.S. Kidney Research Corporation. We started this to, the goal for the company is to create an artificial kidney, working with myself and Jamie Hestigan, who leads the chemical engineering component at the University of Arkansas. And this just shows some of the funding. And what we require now is funding. We've spent about $5 million over the last 4 or 5 years. And if any of you know anyone who might be interested, who's interested in funding projects like this, I would ask you to put them in touch with us. But that gives you an overview of what's going on as far as the technical development in the renal replacement sphere. None of these are available clinically for patients. We have still in the United States about 650,000 patients who are on dialysis, about 100,000 waiting for a kidney transplant. It's interesting that in the last year, the number of patients on dialysis has decreased for the first time since the data has been compiled by the United States government. We have a lot of excellent data on this, because you may know already that since the 1970s, the federal government has funded dialysis therapy. A bunch of nephrologists went to the federal government in the 1970s and said, look, we have this new treatment. It would be unethical for the US government not to fund this new treatment. At the time, it was predicted that the cost would end up being about $500 million a year, 500 million a year. Well, I can tell you 2 years ago, the US government spent 117 billion with a B on the care of kidney patients in the United States, which is about 1/8 to 1/9 of the entire Medicare budget, about $1 trillion a year. So about 1/8 to 1/9 was spent on kidney care, which is another reason for all these initiatives in the last few years. The federal government realizes the expense and wants to come up with other ways of caring for these patients, and is funding to a really small extent some of these initiatives. Most of these are, like our project, are self-funded. So why the number of patients on dialysis has decreased is sort of an interesting question too. One of the causes has been attributed to COVID, that during COVID, there were a lot of deaths of patients, an excess number of deaths of patients who had what we call CKD. So the patients who were in the latter stages prior to getting on dialysis died from COVID. They didn't even have a chance to go on dialysis. Why that occurred is because COVID affects the kidneys. That's number one. And number two, during COVID, patients in general did not get good care for any of their care. There were less patients getting worked up for cancer. There were less patients going to their doctors for all the diseases known to mankind, including kidney disease. And so in general, the population did not get good care outside of COVID. And there were excess deaths in multiple diseases during COVID, not due to COVID, but because of the healthcare systems decreasing the number of visits for patients who didn't have COVID, and for sort of the emphasis being taken away from those other diseases to COVID. So the population in general did not get good health care during those times, including kidney care, and there were excess mortalities. The other reason is that we have newer drugs coming down the pipe that are slowing down the rate of progression of CKD. So the CKD stages that one goes through are less, and the slope, the rate of which one goes from one to the other, is slowing down just because of the new drugs being developed, and that's likely going to continue. The major bugaboo, or the major elephant in the room, is type 2 diabetes. Type 2 diabetes accounts for half of the kidney disease in the US and the planet. If you get rid of type 2 diabetes, you're going to empty out half the dialysis units. And you're going to rid the kidney clinics of half of the CKD patients. So that's the big prize for somebody. And it's going to be, there's a number of drugs that people are working on. Eventually it's going to be solved. But I predict in the next 5 to 10 years, diabetic kidney disease will be solved. And we'll have half the patients. You can say, well, maybe there'll be half the nephrologists. That's great. You know, we're going to rid the world of the major cause of kidney disease. Now, why type 2 diabetes causes kidney disease is not as clear and would require a separate lecture. Remember, there's two types of diabetes. There's the type 1, where you don't have enough insulin. And then there's the type 2, where you have enough insulin. In fact, the pancreas is making more than enough insulin, except the insulin is not working. It's like you have it, but it's not doing its job. And that's because you're overweight. When your weight increases above a certain level, insulin stops working as well. And so you end up again with diabetes, not because you don't have insulin, but because you got plenty, but it's not doing what it needs to do. In that environment, the kidney gets abnormal. It turns out that the filters, the little filters in the kidney, get clogged up. It's like the filter in your bathtub getting clogged up. The kidney isn't able to filter as much. It's that initial filter that we talked about. The holes in the filter get blocked, and it takes about 18 years. And it's a shame because it's all preventable. All that these people would have to do is get their weight back to normal, and there wouldn't be type 2 diabetes. So it's a shame that half the kidney disease in the US and the planet is due to lifestyle. That unfortunately, people like eating more than living a long life. That's what it comes down to. And even though people will say when you tell them they're overweight, yes, they'll go on a diet or they'll exercise. It only lasts for a couple of weeks and they're right back to the way they used to be. The human brain is just wired to eat, and it takes an extremely strong will, or someone getting very angry, or extremely worried and depressed to cut back on their food intake so that their weight is what it should be for their age and sex. So this isn't a human created issue. It's not something from nature. Heaven doesn't create type 2 diabetes. It's because of our love of food that we have type 2 diabetes. And so it's a shame. It's a great cost to the healthcare system. Pharmaceutical companies have to develop drugs that wouldn't have to exist, costing billions and billions of dollars. If all human beings could do was just say, okay, I'm not going to eat. I'm going to get my weight back to what it was when I was 17 or 18. But it just doesn't occur. So that's the big elephant in the room, type 2 diabetes. And the rest of the causes are less common, and in general are created by nature, not humans. And so there's a lot of new drugs coming on the pipe, which are slowing down the progression. The third factor for why there's less people on dialysis is that transplant programs are transplanting patients at a higher GFR or with less loss of kidney function. It used to be they would wait till the kidney function got down to very low levels, then they'd be eligible for a transplant. Now programs are doing what's called preemptive transplantation, where people are getting a transplant when their kidney function is not as severely impaired. And so that's allowing more people to be transplanted. In fact, in the last year, there's been more kidney transplants in the US than ever before. Something like 27 or 28,000 transplants. I can't recall. But there's more than ever before. And that's also causing less people to go on dialysis, which is a great thing, because dialysis has its own issues. If you're on hemodialysis, every time you get dialyzed, you feel washed out in general. Dialysis tends to be a procedure that's done in so-called older individuals. That changes every decade. How old? When should you call someone old? When I was training in Canada years ago, we weren't allowed to dialyze anyone over 65 with certain conditions because it was considered, you were put out to pasture when you were over 65. So if you look at the dialysis units, the average age in a dialysis unit probably is 70, around in the 70, early 70s. And that's just going to keep going up and up and up as the years go by. But, the older you get, when you undergo this procedure, you feel more washed out the next day. And so hemodialysis is not a panacea. And the less people that are on it, the better. In fact, we promote peritoneal dialysis because, number one, it's done at home and you have your privacy. You don't have to rely on going to a clinic. There's no blood involved, so you don't have needles. And many people have needle phobia. They're afraid of needles, including myself. People don't like needles. So peritoneal dialysis allows you not to have needles inserted into your arm. And it's also done at night, so it doesn't interfere with your lifestyle. You do it at night, and you wake up in the morning, you uncap from the catheter, and you go about your daily business. So there's privacy, and people like that also. And plus, it's not as aggressive. So from a biological point of view, hemodialysis is done 3 times a week for 3.5 hours at a time. It's a very aggressive procedure. Imagine the kidney is working 24/7. It doesn't know about holidays. It doesn't get tired. It doesn't get bored. It doesn't know you're sleeping. It's working 24/7 for your entire life. Whereas with hemodialysis, we're doing it for about 9-10 hours a week. So it's very aggressive. Peritoneal dialysis is not perfectly simulating the calendar of the kidney, but it's being done every day at least, and it's being done for half a day, 8, 9, 10 hours a day, a little less than half a day. So it's much more gentle and it accomplishes the same thing, even though in a given period of time, it's not doing as much as hemodialysis. So it's safer, especially if you have cardiovascular instability from a heart attack or other things where your blood pressure is swinging all over the place. Peritoneal dialysis doesn't affect the so-called hemodynamics like peritoneal dialysis doesn't, like hemodialysis. So we always push peritoneal if you can. Not everybody can do it because you have to have had no scars in your abdomen or a lot of previous abdominal surgeries, which can affect the catheter that's inserted. You have to be very clean and sterile and very exact as a person so that you don't hook up yourself wrong and get an infection. You have to wear a mask and gloves like with COVID. You have to do it under sterile conditions. You have to have a significant other who doesn't mind sleeping with you in the same room with the machine going all night. It is quiet, but some spouses or significant others just don't want any device in the room. And you might have to get up in the middle of the night to pee, because many patients with end-stage renal disease still pee. And they're very nervous about walking to the bathroom while they're hooked up to the machine. So you have to have a long catheter because the machine's normally on your night table. You have to have sufficient rooms in your apartment or house, because the solutions are always delivered by a truck and the old one's taken away. Some people don't have that. So there are many social situations that have to be in place for you to be able to do peritoneal dialysis. And in general, in the US, even though it's pushed and pushed and pushed, the numbers don't change much. In other countries like Canada, there's much more peritoneal dialysis. And that has to do with many of the nephrologists not pushing it or being ignorant of it, not having the infrastructure in the dialysis clinic. You need a nurse to teach you how to use the machine, which is about a 2-week course. And they have to have a peritoneal dialysis program where you're seen every month or so. Many clinics don't have that. And there are many reasons. If you go to the Valley in Los Angeles, in our area, for example, it's a heat map of different unpredictable, illogical peritoneal dialysis programs. There's no rhyme or reason to it. It's just the luck of the draw where you live. And it doesn't make any sense medically. Every patient should, with end-stage renal disease, should have equal access to peritoneal dialysis. It doesn't occur. The other is what the feds are pushing and the dialysis companies is what's called home hemodialysis, where you'll have a hemodialysis machine in your apartment, home, or office, and you'll dialyze there with a technician or nurse. And some of the young people are doing it themselves. They put the needles in themselves, get the machine going, and do it themselves. That is 3-4% of all the dialysis patients in the US, even though it's being pushed like crazy because it's cheaper for the feds and the dialysis companies to do that. They don't need the infrastructure of the clinic and the nurses and the rest of it. It's just not accepted. And I can understand why. I think one of the reasons is if you're 70, 80, or 90, you're not going to want to take a risk of having your blood go into a machine at home and something go wrong. You're going to feel much safer if you're in a clinic with other technicians or nurses. And there's also a social aspect to it. A lot of people like going to the clinic. They make new friends there. They see other people in the same situation. So I even though it's being pushed like crazy, I don't see home hemodialysis ever increasing to where many entities want it. So I think I'll stop there. What I wanted to do was give you a real overview of some of the science that's going on to replace hemo and peritoneal dialysis, and to talk to you about the prevalence of kidney disease in the country still, the trends we're seeing with decreased end-stage renal disease patients on dialysis now and why, and to answer any other questions you might have. So thank you for joining.